This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez, as always, with Adam Knott. And today we are going old school. Adam and I first met in the Mises online forums on Mises.org back in the late 2000 aughts, maybe, or maybe early 2010s. And what we really had in common an interest in Ludwig von Mises, and especially Ludwig von Mises's Praxeology. And Adam, you actually have a really cool domain name, like praxeology.com, is it?
I was fortunate enough to get both praxeology.com and praxeology.org, which shows you, when the internet first appeared, in the late 90s or whenever it was. So I'm very proud of those two domains. And I'm sure some people were frustrated that I ended up with them, but it was like, what's it called when you go to the West and you stake a claim, that kind of thing, homesteading or whatever,
Right.
So.
Yeah. And so, that was something that I was really passionate about studying. And so I started doing this series of articles on Mises.org in 2011, where I was kind of just systematically explaining like Mises's economics from the ground up. And so, really from the ground, the ground to build that on is, the theory of knowledge, or what's called epistemology, because that is what Mises grounded his method for economics, and that determined how he conducted economics, and the broader science that he dubbed praxeology, of which economics was just one subset. And so I wrote this article called Mises on Mind and Method, and it a couple years after I published that in 2011, Tom Woods had come across it, and he had started his podcast. This is kind of in the early days of his podcast, the Tom Woods Show. And so he reached out and asked me to come on his show to talk about it. So that was really exciting, because that was, it was my first, I think my first big podcast experience. I think it was after that I started. It definitely was after that I started appearing on the Scott Horton show a few times. And so we'll put both of these pieces in the show notes, both my article Mises on Mind and Method, and I transcribed my interview with Tom on my Medium blog, my medium.com page, and so we could put both in the show notes. I kind of, for me, I like reading the transcript better than hearing myself talk. Like when you read what I said without the ums and ahs, I sound a lot smarter. So I kind of prefer that. But there, there's also a link to the episode if anyone wants to listen to that. But yeah, I thought I'd just kind of use these as references to just talk about Misesian epistemology and praxeology. So Adam, I was just first curious about what was how did you first start learning about Mises's epistemology? Was it Human Action, or was it one of his earlier works, the Epistemological Problems, or his later works like Theory and History or The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science?
No, I actually don't remember, but I'm confident that it probably was human action. And I'm one of, I think when people read human action, um, they are one of two types. Either the first 200 pages is your favorite part, and you don't really care about the other part as much, or it's reversed. Whereas the first 200 pages is like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. But when he starts talking about economics and the banking system and credit and all that, okay, now I'm comfortable with that. And I'm the former. So for me, it's the first 200 pages is all I was really after. It's that thirst for knowledge about the, um, the essence of things, the essence of the way things work, not the later on applications, of banking. Because I personally, as an individual, I'm not that interested in banking and credit. I mean, credit expansion and banking have a huge impact on our lives. But my focus is more on human nature and why we're libertarians and why we have the struggle with the rest of the world. And Mises provides a framework for starting to answer some of those questions with his concept of human action. But I just want to mention before I turn it back to you, Dan, that for the viewers out there, Mises is one of the most inspirational figures for libertarian intellectuals. So I think as an intellectual, you want to know the highest form of knowledge, or you're attracted to the highest forms of knowledge. There could be somebody who's just who makes strong arguments and who's good at polemics, and who's good at disparaging other things, other views, or other theories. But aside from that, what you really, if you're an intellectual, you're thirsting for the basis of knowledge and how human nature works. And Mises provides that, whether one agrees with him or not, or thinks he's perfect or not. He provides a framework for understanding human nature and then applying that understanding to various fields, such as economics, but other fields as well. And so one of the reasons Dan and I had a good working relationship 10 or 15 years ago on the forums is we both had a very, very strong admiration for Ludwig von Mises, his intellectual stature for us as authoritative. Again, it doesn't mean he's perfect, but to us, he's a towering intellectual. He's just as high as you get. And actually, Lord Keynes once read when he was reviewing a Mises book, the phrase he used about Mises was "learned in the highest degree." I mean, how that's what you want to be called, learned in the highest degree. So that says it all.
Especially if it's your ideological enemy who can't help but begrudge you such a compliment.
Yeah. So and I, of course, as libertarians, we're not in favor of Keynesian economics, but Keynes probably was a relatively intelligent person. Mises was courting his opinion, so Mises was interested in that. So anyway, I'm interested to talk about this. This is a very interesting topic for me, and happy to delve in with you, Dan.
I remember Rothbard writing that Keynes had written a review of one of Mises's books. I think it was The Theory of Money and Credit. And he said that it contains no new ideas, which is just laughably wrong. But then Rothbard pointed out that Keynes said elsewhere that he only, when he's reading German, that he can only understand things that he already knows, that he can't understand new ideas written in German. And he had reviewed the German, this was before it was translated, he was reviewing the German language edition of it. So it's like, well, if you don't understand new ideas in German, Like, why would you say that a German book contains no new ideas when you yourself admit that if there was, you wouldn't be able to understand it?
I remember that. I think Mises mentioned that concept as well, what you just said. So, yeah. Anyway, we both have a large, huge admiration for Mises. And I'm just trying to explain to anybody who's listening the special place he holds in our hearts. And he's helped guide many intellectuals or would-be intellectuals and guided them their mental or intellectual development. And I'm definitely been hugely influenced by him and owe him, much gratitude.
Me too. I mean, when I first discovered his works, it was like, oh my gosh, this guy's a genius. He's figured it out, because everything, his whole system of thought, it just like made sense to me. It just clicked for me. And so, I just, I think at one point I made it, I was confirmed that I had read every single book that he had ever published, or at least that was available in English, because I was just so fascinated with his ideas, and that's why I wrote that series of articles, because it was really part of my learning process, that like I really wanted to just grok, in the original sense of that word, grok his ideas, and the only way that I could do it was by synthesizing it through writing. And so that's why in this article, I draw on like several of his books. Like, I would take on one subtopic and then, draw on like every book in which he discussed that subtopic. Like I would draw on that and reference it and quote it. So I'll just start by reading the introduction to my article. I wrote, when Austrian economist Thomas DiLorenzo recently testified before the House Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy, and side note, I imagine that it was Ron Paul who got him that appearance. Congressman William Lacey Clay tried to dismiss the Austrian School of Economics as lacking, quote, scientific rigor, because it relies on, quote, deductive reasoning. There is something dystopian about a member of the government saying to a dissenting intellectual, in essence, "Isn't it true, sir, that you are part of a group of thinkers who uses dun 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 logic?" Not even the obtuse inquisitors of Socrates, Abelard, and Galileo would have been so bold. I just remember seeing that and just being completely aghast about that question.
Well, he was in the lion's den, so you had, when you walk, you're basically like in the forum, the Roman forum or something, and they're just, so you were in hostile territory. You were going to take incoming. That's just the way it works. Doesn't matter if your cause is just or if you're honest and they're dishonest. It doesn't matter. It's just the nature of the beast is you're the enemy, and that's all it is.
It has become a popular trick among people who are unprepared to grapple with the actual economic arguments of the Austrian school to try to short circuit the debate by groaning zombie-like, unscientific, with hardly any familiarity outside of what they were taught in grade school, of even the epistemological issues concerning the natural sciences, let alone the even more neglected epistemological issues concerning the social sciences. Crude methodological critiques like these against sound economics are old, predating Austrian economics itself. Before Karl Menger had even started the Austrian school, the members of the German historical school thought they could discredit the classical economists, not by actually grappling with their arguments, but by simply dismissing the whole enterprise of theoretical economics as quote, bloodless abstractions. And I don't get into this in the article, but then what happened is that that Carl Menger then did found the Austrian School of Economics when he published Principles of Economics. And that was the book that when Mises read it, he said that made an economist out of him. But then, as soon as it was published, the Austrian school, not the Austrian school, the historical school of Austrian economics, I keep saying Austrian economics, the historical school, which was I mean, there's part of it was kind of like nationalism because, the historical school, they were German, like they were like Prussian, and so they looked down on the Austrians, and I think Austrian was coined by them. It was like an epithet.
Supposed to
It's
be
like,
derogatory, yeah.
right. It's just like, those silly little Austrians, and Gustav Schmoller was like the leader of this school, and they just relentlessly attacked Menger and his method, and then Menger fought back, and they wrote piece after piece, just critiquing the other side and answering the other side, and so that kind of like war of words even got a name. Like they called it the Methodenstreit, or the fight over method, basically. And on one hand, it was kind of good for Menger to lay out the case for the proper method of theoretical economics, but also it's kind of like a distraction. Like it's sad that he kept having to argue about method, and that gave him less time to use that method to develop economics proper, to advance this new Austrian approach. But that was left to his protege, Eugen von Bavaverk, and von Bavaverk's student Mises to finish the job.
To build on the, or to follow in the path of Menger, and to and the kind of the way of approaching the problems of economics, and a certain method of doing so, in opposition to the institutional, I believe. So when you mentioned the historical school, I picture the same as today, as where you have institutionally approved thought or dogma, or theory, versus independent or dissenting takes on the same information. And we had that, again, not to return to COVID over and over, but the same thing. We had all the institutional practitioners, or theorists of medicine, and then you had dissenting voices. So even back then in the 1800s and the early 1900s, there was such a thing as institutional, the institutional view versus the independent or dissenting view. And then it's almost like a political struggle, because these the German historicists occupied important chairs. It was already at the point where there's such a thing as a chair, and so they could make appointments, and they controlled a political fiefdom, or area, just like today with Fauci, with his control of all that budget. So you can make or break careers by controlling the budget, and that's what it was. I think that's kind of how it was with the same thing with the historical school. Something similar, where it had already become a matter of the institutions protecting their view of things and their structure.
Definitely.
Their structure.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, the historical school was nicknamed the intellectual bodyguard of the House of Hohenzollern. So like Hohenzollern was like the royal house, and so they weren't unbiased seekers of truth. Like they were trying to defend the agenda and interest of the state.
A political
Um,
order,
right,
simply said, defending a political order and the ideas that sustain it,
right.
the
Yeah,
justification for it.
yeah, and to do that, it makes sense that they would want to debunk classical economics as well as the burgeoning Austrian economics, because basically they those schools of thought were placing what has been referred to as parameters on the utopias of reformers and of rulers, because they were proposing economic laws that even monarchs and and utopian reformers had to abide by, just as much as they had to abide by the law of gravity. And so it and they didn't like that. They didn't like having any kind of, oh, you can't do this because it will only result in these economic consequences. And so it would make sense that a doctrine like the historical school would appeal to them, because the historical school would say, like, what do you mean, like, laws? Like, what do you mean these laws that you've derived through reason? It's like there's no such thing. Like we have to look at history and judge based on that. And of course, history is open to any number of interpretations. And so it'd be easy to say, like, okay, well, this happened in the past, and therefore, the our rulers or our reformers, should be free to do, to do likewise, or to do otherwise, because things went badly in the past, or something like that. And it's basically writing a blank check to the state.
I think, the Austrians, the threat you're talking about was the idea that if economic laws would say, if you try this policy, it can't actually reach the objective, that the stated objective. So it acts as a rail or a brake on government policy. And if you don't want that rail, or that brake, or that stopping force, you're going to fight the person who's bringing that to the table. Goofy, very minor example is when I was trying to preach the idea that you're not going to make Bitcoin into a medium of exchange. And I was trying to talk to anybody about it, but nobody wanted to talk about it. So I couldn't even get on the most lowest level podcast or the most lowest level discussion, because people didn't want to entertain that idea. So that shows again how in history there is a thing where what does the person or the world want, and that's what they're not. So an idea can be rejected not because it's wrong, but just because that's not what people want. And so I've made the argument that the Austrian theory or Austrian economics wasn't rejected because it was wrong. It's because it implied non-interventionism was almost its essential conclusion as one of the best economic policies. The world did not want to hear that. The world was headed in an interventionist direction and wanted instruction on how and where to intervene. That's what they wanted. So if you're bringing them the message, oh, well, you actually shouldn't intervene, they're like, next. Because what part about me asking where and how to intervene didn't you understand? So
Yeah,
your services are not wanted here.
They don't want to hear what Al Gore called an inconvenient truth. But which is ironic, because like Al Gore was using that expression as he was advancing a politically convenient falsehood. um, anyway, yeah, and we see that kind of thing. You mentioned Keynes earlier. With Keynes, that he was preaching what the powers that be wanted to hear. And it's no coincidence that the New Deal came first and then the Keynesian revolution came along, because Keynes's claims just validated exactly what the government was already hell-bent on doing with so continuing on, Ludwig von Mises remarked that when faced with such potentially biased methodological attacks on the validity of sound economics, it may seem appropriate to simply, quote, let the dogs bark and pay no heed to their yelping, and to remember the dictum of Baruch Spinoza that, quote, just as light defines itself in darkness, so truth sets the standard for itself and falsity. However, Mises rejected such an above-it-all approach, insisting, quote, no scientist is entitled to assume beforehand that a disapprobation of his theories must be unfounded because his critics are imbued by passion and party bias. He is bound to reply to every censure without any regard to its underlying motives or its background. He considered spelling out the foundational underpinnings of economics to be essential. For this reason, Mises devoted a significant amount of his scientific attention to epistemological and methodological problems. In what follows, I will endeavor to systematically explain Mises's epistemology and its bearing on his economics, drawing especially on his treatise, Human Action, or treatises, Human Action, Theory and History, and the Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. Next section, Mises characterized economics as an a priori science. By this, he means that economic laws are prior to and independent of economic experience, and that it makes no sense to try to test economic laws with experiments, observations, statistics, or any other kind of empirical data. This position tends to immediately set off alarms with people inculcated with a simplistic version of the methods used by the natural sciences. Some even go so far as to malign such an approach as quote-unquote religious, because anything that isn't based on empirical facts must be faith-based. One wonders if such critics think of geometry as a religion, being that the theorems of geometry are prior to and not based on the gathering of topographical data. More on that comparison later. Yeah, I remember attending a Mises Circle event back in the day, and I remember Walter Block giving a talk, and someone in the audience objecting, making that exact objection. That how is your approach different from religion? Like, how is that not a religious approach to economics? And I forget how Walter Block answered, or if he used like the geometry metaphor. Like maybe that's where I got it from, or I probably got it from. I'm sure. I'm sure I remember other, like it being written in other Austrian literature. I'm sure I got it from somewhere. But yeah, is that's what you always, that kind of objection is very common. Such critics don't realize that all reasoning, including the reasoning of the natural sciences, has an a priori aspect. To deny this would be to think of the mind in the way that is, as Mises wrote, quote, implied in the famous dictum of John Locke, according to which the mind is a sheet of white paper upon which the external world writes its own story. So that's also known as the blank slate doctrine, or tabula rasa. On the contrary, the quote, human mind is not a tabula rasa on which the external events write their own history, close quote. That's Mises. There is an empiricist doctrine that nothing is in the intellect that has not previously been in the senses. As Mises noted, the philosopher Gottfried Leibniz added the essential proviso, quote, except the intellect itself, close quote. This is because for external events to even become knowledge, they need to be processed by the intellect/mind. And for the mind to meaningfully process events, it must be, as Mises puts it, close quote, equipped with a set of tools for grasping reality, close quote. Mises credited Immanuel Kant for spelling out this key insight. Quote, experience, Kant taught, provides only the raw material out of which the mind forms what is called knowledge, close quote. The quote, set of tools for grasping reality, close quote, are certain inbuilt conceptions that the mind must apply to raw sensations in order for those sensations to be converted into actual knowledge. We must have these conceptions, for all sensation would be meaningless without their application. And these conceptions must be inbuilt because they cannot be learned, since learning is the acquisition of knowledge, meaningful interpretations of external and internal sensations. And the acquisition of knowledge presupposes the capacity to apply these reality grasping conceptions. Kant called these inbuilt conceptions, I forget why I didn't say innate, because usually it's the word innate is used there, but for some reason I decided to lean on the word inbuilt. Kant called these inbuilt conceptions categories, a term Mises used very frequently. Mises referred to the categories as necessary features of the logical structure of the human mind, and as the mind's, quote, projection into the external world of becoming and change. Quote, all knowledge is conditioned by the categories that precede any data of experience, both in time and in logic. The categories are a priori. They are the mental equipment of the individual that enables him to think and, we may add, to act. So I'll pause there if you have any comments.
Well, yeah, my understanding of Mises is that he believed that the human mind has a definitive structure. So, and that structure is what ultimately gives rise to the regularities that we experience. So this is a strain of thought of Austrian economics, of certain very high-level thinkers in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s, that were working with that were exploring a method that could be referred to as the epistemological method. So the epistemological method rests on the thesis that the regularities we experience in social and also in physical phenomena is a function of the structure of the human mind. So the one example I always use is that if I walk towards, my action is walking towards the other side of the room, I necessarily walk away from the side of the room that's behind me. And so that in a sense can serve as a simple example of what Mises is talking about. You wouldn't test that. You wouldn't test it because it's just in the nature of the action that there is a counterpart. It's almost like the idea that if you head somewhere, you leave something behind. And modern science believes that's the way the universe works, but there's another way to approach it, which is that's the way the mind works. That the mind is structured such that when one thing happens, there has to be some sort of counterpart. We've heard, for example, in science, we've heard every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So you could say, well, okay, that's when there was no human beings. That's what the universe was doing. There was an action and there was opposite reaction. But an epistemologist doesn't see it that way. The epistemologist would see it as that our mind is structured such that when we observe an event, our mind automatically attaches a counterpart to that event that always has to come with that. So an example would be every time I walk towards one location, I walk away from a different location. So the theory of knowledge that Mises was groping towards or moving towards or trying to understand was how to understand economics or social phenomena with regard to the logic of the human mind. I have 3 passages here where Mises refers to the logical structure of the human mind. Human knowledge is conditioned by the structure of the human mind. If it chooses human action as the subject matter of its inquiries, it cannot mean anything else than the categories of action which are proper to the human mind. This is one of my favorites. For as must be emphasized again, the reality, the elucidation, and interpretation of which is the task of praxeology is congeneric with the logical structure of the human mind. What he's saying is that praxeology is just trying to understand the observed regularities as functions of the human mind. That's what he was trying to do. Here's another passage. But the problem of the a priori is of a different character. It refers to the essential and necessary character of the logical structure of the human mind. So, and one last passage. We must bethink ourselves and reflect upon the structure of action. Another one of my favorite passages. So for Mises, it's not just the statement that man acts and then having discursive point counterpart discussions about the logical implications of that. He's actually trying to understand within himself this idea that every day when I get up, I try to reach a goal. That's inbred within me or innate within me. So what are the implications of that? And how does that apply to the world that I observe? So it was a very, very, very sophisticated program that they were trying to found. And the world did not want that. The world was not looking for that. The world was looking to solve very practical problems having to do with intervention, government intervention. And so this kind of novel, almost eccentric probably to them approach had almost no value, whereas it was this gem of thinking, but it had no value in the world that was forming at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned man acts, and that's what Murray Rothbard called the action axiom. And so that was different from the way Mises talked about it, because he didn't use the word axiom. He used the word category. He called it the category of action. And I wonder if Rothbard, like Ayn Rand, they weren't Kantians. Like Ayn Rand hated Immanuel Kant.
Right. Yeah.
Or Kant. And they were both more Aristotelian and Thomist, like St. Thomas Aquinas, than Kantian. And so I wonder if that was part of it. Like, I wonder if Mises was more Kantian, and so that's why he used categories, whereas the axiom was kind of more of an Aristotelian approach to this notion of action as the fundamental concept.
Yeah, it's definitely two different understandings. If I personally believe that Rand and Rothbard wouldn't have actually understood what Mises was doing that well, or wouldn't have agreed with his program to try to, because those passages I read about the human mind definitely are not anywhere to be found in their works. So either they strongly disagreed with it or they didn't understand it, one or the other. Because if they understood it and they agreed with it, then they would be pursuing that path of knowledge. You'd be reading about it in their books. But I have, at the appropriate time, I can read even more amazing passages. The ones I've read from Hayek, where he, I think you're familiar with them. I've read them several different times, but we could do that a little bit later, maybe.
Sure. Yeah. All right. So a primary example of this mental equipment is the laws of logic themselves. Applications of what Mises called the fundamental logical relations, for example, the law of non-contradiction, is necessary for all reasoning regarding truth and falsity, but the principles of logic themselves are not, quote, are not subject, now this is Mises, are not subject to proof or disproof. Every attempt to prove them must presuppose their validity. It is impossible to explain them to a being who would not possess them on his own account. Efforts to define them according to the rules of definition must fail. They are primary propositions antecedent to any nominal or real definition. They are ultimate and unanalyzable categories. The human mind is utterly incapable of imagining logical categories at variance with them. No matter how they may appear to superhuman beings, they are for man inescapable and absolutely necessary. They are the indispensable prerequisite of perception, apperception, and experience. The a priori forms and categories of human thinking and reasoning cannot be traced back to something of which they would appear as the logically necessary conclusion. It is contradictory to expect that logic could be of any service in demonstrating the correctness or validity of the fundamental logical principles. All that can be said about them is that to deny their correctness or validity appears to the human mind nonsensical, and that thinking, guided by them, has led to modes of successful acting. So yeah, like, I try to sort of explain Mises's propositions throughout this article, but sometimes like you just can't, like the way Mises words it himself, like you just have to quote like really long passages like that one, because he just says it so perfectly. Yeah, that's just one of those passages that was just so mind-opening for me to read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little. The ideas are a little bit complex, but I think he's trying to say that you can't ask for proof of everything. You can't ask for proof of the foundation of your attempt to prove. In other words, at some point you get down to a place where that's just a given. And I think for Mises, action is a given. In other words, I'm born, and as far as I consciously can remember, I've always attempted to achieve something, whether it's, whether you're trying to get a glass of juice, whether you're trying to get to the next room. So what Mises is saying, these things are they're foundational to your existence, and so some things have to be accepted. And then it gets complicated because does that mean therefore other people have to accept that? If I say, here's the foundation of knowledge or foundation of the theory, it's indisputable. what is that? What I'm trying to say is, I think you're either interested in that and building a theory on that, but if it becomes interpersonal where you're trying to force someone to have a belief, then I think it gets you're led astray now. So to me, what Mises is saying is valuable for somebody who's trying to understand things. But I think there's a danger of people thinking that he's trying to say something that if you tell somebody else, they need to believe it because it's so true. So I think those are two different ways of approaching. And I think, let me say true knowledge, let's say, is valuable for somebody who's seeking the truth. But as soon as it becomes something where you're using it politically, meaning to force somebody else to change their conduct, now you've introduced something into the mix that has changed the situation.
Yeah. I mean, you can't use a law of logic to prove that same law of logic. Like, it's just begging the question. It's assuming that which is to be proved. And so like the law of the excluded middle, like, all A's are B and all B's are C, therefore all A's are C. It's like, if you use that logic in an argument against someone and they denied the law of the excluded middle, it's like you can't really argue them out of that. like first of all, they don't really believe that. Like if assuming they're at all like my mind, at least I know that they can't actually believe that. They're either like, maybe they're misspeaking, they're misunderstanding what is being argued about, and so, or they're lying, or they are some kind of like non-human with like a logical structure different, at least from mine, and different from yours, who like, and different from anybody's who, like, accepts that is true. And so that's why Mises said it's an unanalyzable, irreducible given, a starting point. You could call it an axiom, because an axiom is a proposition that you derive from, but that you don't derive it from anything else. So then I start to talk about causality itself. Even the natural sciences must take recourse to a priori categories. Considering observed experiences scientifically useful at all for discovering causal laws itself rests on what Mises called an a prioristic assumption. Quote, experience is necessarily of past events. It can be resorted to for the prediction of future events only with the aid of the assumption that an invariable uniformity prevails in the concatenation and succession of natural phenomena. And then, close quote. Only with this a prioristic assumption can one infer, quote, from the regularity observed in the past to the same regularity in future events, close quote. Furthermore, now this is me again. Furthermore, as David Hume pointed out in his famous discussion of the problem of induction, if you say that we can know that prior regularity predicts subsequent regularity because it has reliably done so in the past, then that is simply begging the question. committing the logical fallacy of assuming that which is to be proved. That would be assuming that a prior regularity, which is prior regularity predicting subsequent regularity in the past, predicts a subsequent regularity. That prior regularity predicting subsequent regularity in the future, which is exactly what one is trying to prove in the first place. What Mises calls the category of causality is our inbuilt or innate conception that past regularity predicts future regularity. That conception is prerequisite to all reasoning regarding cause and effect in the natural world. As Mises wrote, agreeing with Hume, there is no deductive proof that past regularity predicts future regularity. Quote, there is no, I always want to read the quotes in an Austrian accent, if I could do an Austrian accent, just to kind of make it clear, because I quote him so much to distinguish between what I'm saying and what Mises is saying. There is no deductive demonstration possible of the principle of causality and of the ampliative inference of imperfect induction. There is only recourse to the no less indemonstrable statement that there is a strict regularity in the conjunction of all natural phenomena. If we were not to refer to this uniformity, all the statements of the natural sciences would appear to be hasty generalizations. Close quote. However, there is no other imaginable way of making sense of the material world without assuming that past regularity predicts future regularity. Without taking recourse to the category of causality, the physical universe around us would be a meaningless jumble of sensations. Not only the natural sciences, but everyday life would be impossible without our innate conception that past regularity does indeed predict future regularity. Without it, we would never have developed agriculture because we would have no reason to infer from past seasonal cycles that similar seasonal cycles might occur in the future. Without it, we would never even avoid contact with flame because we would have no reason to infer from past contact the pain and damage we would incur from future contact. Quote, in a world, this is Mises again, in a world without causality and regularity of phenomena, there would be no field for human reasoning and human action. Such a world would be a chaos in which man would be at a loss to find any orientation and guidance. Man is not even capable of imagining the conditions of such a chaotic universe. And what's interesting is that Hans Hermann Hoppe then argues that, based on what Mises wrote, that not only is it the case that deduction in praxeology is actually more scientific than induction in the natural sciences, or more sure and logical, but he considers induction and regularity in the natural world to be a category of action, to be a deduction from action, because if you can think of action, action presupposes acting in a world with regularity. He argued, because if there was no regularity, then you couldn't really act, because there would be no predicting whether any action would have any kind of effect in the first place.
Well, I guess my comment is, for the viewer, it seems academic, all this discussion. So what's it all about? Why is all this important? And I think, to me, it comes down to the idea that if a huge social failure that occurred didn't necessarily have to occur, then all we have to do is adjust. Then we did it wrong. We make an adjustment, and it'll succeed the next time. So, to be specific, an example would be in the history of Austrian economics, and a very important question would be, can you have a modern society without the price system? So the Austrian economists would have said, no, you can't. But there were theorists in socialist schools who said, yes, you can. What you can do is have a committee of people, and excuse me, 1 second. Hey, love. Yeah, help me somehow. Close the door or something like that. It's just going too loud. Try to keep the noise down. So we have remodel work going on.
Yeah, no worries.
In other words, all this kind of detailed discussion, the reason it's controversial is because the people who wanted to enact certain policies didn't want to be constrained by a cost-benefit analysis of, so to speak, of whether it would work or not. And so they had to say, no, this will work, to have the public support, so the public would support it. So it's a great example of the price system, because communism in the middle of the 1900s was an attempt to substitute committee decision making for the price system, and it failed. And the Austrian economists said that just won't work. So what happened was a lot of people were killed and harmed by that attempt. So the attempt can be made, but it couldn't succeed. But what happens in these kinds of controversies is the people who supported them will say, well, we just didn't do it correctly. So if we do it better next time, it will succeed. So what Mises wants to say is, no, it's in the nature of the thing you did that it can't succeed, because what you're doing is against the nature of the thing itself. An example would be in the past, whenever I've been at the ocean and I swam out to shore and I kept swimming and swimming out further and further, I got so far out that I couldn't get back, or people did, and they died. But there's nothing in the nature of swimming out to shore really far that made that happen. If I take care the next time and swim farther and farther out to shore, there's a chance that the next time I'll be safe, still at a safe distance from the shore. So that's the controversy. What all these arguments, they're all trying to say the same thing, is that there's some sort of necessity in human action such that if you do, certain things can't be accomplished because they're contrary to the way the thing works. I'll give you a really great example of this. So theoretically, a person could be strong enough in their arms to lift their own weight. So let's say a person weighs 150 pounds and you give them a 150-pound weight and say, can you lift this up off the ground? So you watch them, and they're so strong that they grab the two handles on it and they lift it up off the ground. So it's proven that they can lift 150 pounds. So then you say, well, okay, great. So this is really wonderful. So now, theoretically, you should be able to put your hands under your feet and pull up, and thereby lift yourself off the ground. Because all the pieces are in place for you to be. We've already proven that you can do it. So the person who wants to accomplish that policy would try to do it and say that the failure was due to something that could be adjustable, that we could adjust. Well, yeah, I couldn't do it last time, but I just didn't try hard enough. And where have we heard that before? With communism, it's just we didn't try hard enough. We didn't imprison enough people. It's just they get more and more. So there's something, what Mises is trying to say, and the people who believe in necessity are trying to say, is that there's something in the nature, in human nature, or in social nature, or if you want, in physical nature, such that certain policies can't succeed. But the people who want to do it say, no, that your reasoning isn't working. So that's where the conflict's coming in. It's a conflict over social it's a social argument, because somebody wants to do something that's going to impact you or impact society, and you're claiming that here's going to be the result. Like, for example, modern monetary theory. The incharitable reading of that was that you can print money and inflation won't happen. And that's very appealing to governments, because that means that's a way just to keep paying for expanded government. And so modern monetary theory was partially responsible for the inflation we had in the United States, I think 3 or 4 years ago, because I think the Fed was listening to some modern monetary theorists who talked the Fed into believing that if they kept printing money, that inflation wouldn't happen. And Mises would make the point, no, inflation has to happen because there's something in the nature of economics that printing money is synonymous or is the same thing as inflation. So it's kind of hard for people to understand why these things are so controversial, and what Daniel's reading, the importance of it. How does it apply to our lives? That's what I've been trying to explain.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that, like, this reasoning is used to give a firm, solid, and certain derivation of all of economics, and therefore anything that economics is useful for, like understanding, that the fact that you can't print your way to prosperity, that or like the fact that um socialist bureaucracies can't calculate, because it's derived from this understanding, and it's just putting a floor on those derivations. It's saying, like, okay, well, we understand economic calculation and the impossibility of economic calculation in a socialist commonwealth, because we understand what prices are, and what prices represent, and how prices are used by entrepreneurs to um, economize the means of production in a way that is meaningfully informed by the value judgments of millions and millions of strangers. And you can only understand that if you understand price theory. And you can only really understand price theory if you can understand human action. Like, if you can understand what preference scales are, and how preference scales interface to create, like, supply and demand curves, and like the law of diminishing marginal utility, and how that comes into play with prices. And you can only understand all of those things, like, if you understand action and its immediate deductions, like scarcity and cost, and just these just basic concepts. And so it's important to know that, and it's important to know that's the only way that you can make judgments about whether a certain economic policy is sound or not, and that you can't make those kinds of judgments through inductive reasoning and empirically based reasoning, because that kind of reasoning only makes sense when you do have uniform regularity, and you can have uniform regularity in the natural world, and you can do controlled experiments that are simple enough that you can make that you can derive laws of nature, laws of physics, for example, from those experiments. But you can't do that with human action, because human action is too complex and unpredictable. That the same conditions, that you can't even control for the conditions, but even if you could control for the external conditions, like different people will just respond differently, and there's no controlling for that. And so yeah, so ultimately all this stuff matters, because and it matters for libertarians, because it's like, ultimately you're going to be like arguing with people who will just keep questioning all of your premises, and eventually the questioning will boil down to these ultimate premises. So it makes sense to have those ultimate premises dialed in and figured out.
Yeah, for me, I, it's very clear to me why these ideas are controversial. And it's because if certain activities have to have certain consequences, and the public believes that, then anybody who go there, then you can pin that consequence on that person who did the policy. But if the person who did the policy can successfully argue that the negative consequence wasn't due to what they did, but was due to some other factor, then that person can keep doing that thing and keep blaming the consequences on something else.
Exactly.
And so what I feel the Austrian school of thought was trying to show was that what's the connection between something, a policy or a social action, and a consequence of that action? How can we demonstrate that? And so Mises tried the one thing, for example, tried to base that on the mental categories. Hayek came up with a concept of spontaneous order. So, for example, Hayek would argue, if based on his theory, that that if something emerges spontaneously and you intervene, then you would interfere with the spontaneity, you would interfere with the natural progression, and you would damage that thing. So they keep returning to this very simple idea that is there some limit to what we can do, because we think that we have all the options on the table, but maybe only some of them can succeed and some can't. So maybe some things are bound to fail because of the nature of the activity. But people who want to do those things don't want to hear that. So then it becomes controversial, because just in our human discourse, we've all had experience of saying to somebody, "Oh, well, if you do that, then X is going to happen. I told you so." And the other person says, "No, I don't think so. I don't think that will happen if I do this." And so there's the controversy. Of course, it becomes more controversial if it's going to impact you. So if somebody's going to do something which is going to profoundly impact you, for example, if they're driving a car, while intoxicated, for example, then it becomes very important whether the person believes that what they're doing is going to have a bad consequence, or whether they agree with you that it will, and therefore they're willing to stop doing it. So that's where the controversy comes in, because in society, as we know now, that there's groups of people who want to do all sorts of policies and stuff that we know is going to affect us adversely, and they keep maintaining that it's going to lead to a better future, but they're harming a ton, thousands and millions of people on this idea. So I think the Austrian economists, excuse me, I keep saying that wrong. We're trying to show, prove where does the source of regularity that shows why you can't have a modern society without a price system. How can we show that people that, so that you won't have to kill millions and millions of people and then take a U-turn in 1980 after you've killed millions upon millions of people, trying to implement a modern society without a price system, putting people in jail, so these are very serious questions.
Yeah, I mean, Mises wrote Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, explaining the calculation problem of socialism, back in like 1920, just shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. And, eventually they learned from experience the failures of socialism, but that was at the cost of, to make that omelet cost a lot of broken eggs, a lot of broken lives and destroyed lives, and could have all been avoided if they had just read Mises and understood the logic of it.
Yeah, as we would say, if people were willing to accept that there is regularity, or that there are such a thing as economic laws or laws underlying our behavior, and accept that and pursue the knowledge of those with the goal of reaching an outcome that would be hopefully beneficial for everyone. But if people refuse to want to pursue that goal, and have certain policies that they're just wedded to, or certain visions that they're wedded to, and they have to try them and basically only learn the hard way, that certain things don't work. So that's kind of where, again, that's where the controversy comes in, because the theories that Austrian economists were working with, if adhered to, would restrict government intervention. And so anybody who's in favor of government intervention then is incentivized to propose an alternate theory, which says, no, if we intervene, it's going to be good things are going to happen, not bad things. And so so then there's the argument and the counter argument. And
so in the next section, I start to get into the actual praxeology by talking about action. So the most important mental equipment for thinking about mankind is the category of teleology, or action, our innate conception of purpose and purposeful behavior. Action, defined by Mises as purposeful behavior, is the use of means to seek an end, the end always being the relief from a felt uneasiness, Mises said. Just as the natural world would be a meaningless jumble of sensations without the category of causality, the social world around us, as well as our understanding of our own states of mind, would be a meaningless jumble of sensations if we were not equipped with the category of teleology in action. The conception of action in general is necessarily prior to the cognition of any particular action. Gestures and words would be meaningless motions and sounds unless the mind were able to apply the conception of purpose to them. And how could you explain purpose to someone who did not already have an innate conception of it, when such an explanation would be to your student meaningless motions and sounds? If I know anything, I know what action is. With every sentence I write, with the purpose of communicating to you, the reader, I live it. And if you are looking at these words with the purpose of understanding them, you too are living it. Should I try to deny the reality of purpose, means, and ends, I would find myself caught in the manifest absurdity of trying to deny the reality of trying.
In trying to disprove action, you were acting. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah, you're trying to deny trying. It's just it's what Hoppe would call a performative contradiction.
Yeah, I just put. I will just say that as Mises said many times, that we have an innate knowledge of trying to reach goals. It's something that's just within us. So we're very familiar with it. But that doesn't mean we're familiar. We've given thought to the structure of that, and what is the exact structure of that. But if we could make progress on figuring out, in a sense, our human nature to innately pursue goals, that might shed light on the feasibility of various goals. Because if we knew the structure, how we're built to invariably always try to attain a certain situation over and over. And I'm trying to attain a cup of coffee. I'm trying to attain a movie ticket. I'm trying to attain a day at the beach. And so this is repetitive. So if I could figure how I'm constructed, and particularly with social issues, other people, it might help me, guide me how to interact socially if I knew more about myself. So it's a way of understanding social phenomena by understanding ourselves better. I don't know. That might have been from left field there, but it just came out.
Yeah, and I don't even know how much repetition it takes, because like repetition would only help, or repetition would only be necessary if like repetition helps, like if you see, B following A number of times, and then you start recognizing that pattern, and then you can come up with like a law of like, okay, B precedes A, follows A. But with the experience of your own action and the action of other people, it's like if you don't understand it as action from the get-go, I don't see how repetition would even help, because it would just be, hand moved this way and grabbed water this way. Like there isn't anything inherently like that inherently like manifests as purpose there, unless you are reading purpose into it and understand and can already have the mental equipment to understand purpose. And so it seems like even before any experience, so it truly is a priori that you have the capacity to understand it. And it's an interesting child development question, because it's like, okay, well, do children understand action like when they're babies? And then is it experience that helps them understand that? But it's not experience quite like other experience of those kinds of patterns of sequence, because it's not a matter of sequence. And so it seems to me that even as babies, that it really is inbuilt, it's innate, it's born, that we're born, if not born automatically with like, from being a fetus even, of like being able to understand what action is, but at least that being built in our developmental blueprint such that we like our the way that we grow up, like it just and the way our brains develop, that brains develop so that they have the capacity to understand action, and then it's used to infer action from just the motions, what would otherwise just be meaningless motions, or mindless motions, and that we actually infer that just because that's just how God created us.
Yeah, I understand. It's a little bit it's a little bit advanced. What I think you're trying to say, the difference between teleology and what was the other one, the other in philosophy, the opposite way.
Causality.
So the idea is that, like you said, with the cup of coffee that I'm holding, it automatically has a meaning to me. I'm not neutral with regard to that object. I'm interested in its relationship to me. So that's because I'm constructed in a way that it's that way. So it's the idea of the natural science way of looking at things is different than the social science way of looking at things. And one way I feel I've successfully been able to capture the difference of what you're talking about, Dan, is that I would make a very succinct distinction between social science and physical science. So that physical science is looking at the relationship between two objects, and social science is looking at the relationship between an object and a human intention. So that clearly defines the two, because social science, as I would argue, and I could make the argument intellectually more rigorously, that physical science is looking at two objects and the relationship of those, with the assumption that there's no consciousness involved in that equation. And social science doesn't start there. It starts with a consciousness and an object. So it's a totally different foundation. So it's kind of similar to what you're saying. There's two different ways we can interpret the content of our observations with respect to, there's a lamp over here and a table over here. So now I can start measuring distance and height and color. Or I can start, for example, saying, does that lamp make me happy? That's not the same thing as the other one. Now we've introduced something. And to explicitly say that does that lamp make me happy is totally valid, because we know that there's something called happiness that we experience, and we know certain objects make us happy. Does this ice cream make me happy? Does this brick that fell on my toe make me happy? And so it's totally valid to look at how objects impact my well-being or my happiness. And now we're doing social science. We're not doing physical science, because we just introduced an ephemeral ethereal concept called happiness or well-being, or as Mises said, uneasiness, or however you want to say it. So now we're on a different trajectory. And a physicist and a mathematician say, yeah, but this is all wishy-washy stuff. You guys are terrible at it. And, when I read social science, it's gobbledygook. And maybe they have a point. But that just means that we haven't found a way to make it more rigorous. Or maybe some would say we have. But I think it's hopefully generally agreed that social science is in a way worse state than physical science as far as progression. But anyway, I'm just trying to the different approaches to the content of our consciousness.
Yeah, and another way of phrasing it is with Aristotle's types of causation, because he had 4 types of causation, and what we're calling teleology is what Aristotle called final causation, and what Mises calls causality That's what Aristotle called the efficient cause. So there's the final cause and the efficient cause. And so if you want to say like, okay, what was the cause of, me drinking this water? It's like, okay, well, there's the efficient cause, which is just that, my arm muscles moved the water to my mouth and tilted it, and gravity made the water fall down my throat.
And that would be the natural scientific explanation of it.
Right. Or there's the final cause, which is to say I was thirsty. And I had the end or goal of slaking my thirst, and that's what caused me to drink the water.
The social scientific explanation of it. The two different approaches to the same, but it's the same content.
Yeah, so now to actually get into it, praxeology proper, I wrote, action, although it is an innate conception, is not as simple a conception as one might first think. There are quite a few subsidiary notions that are bundled up or implied in the notion of action. The unbundling of those notions, making explicit that which is implicit about action, is what Mises referred to as the science of praxeology, of which the science of economics is a sub-discipline. Mises wrote, "The scope of praxeology is the explication of the category of human action." I mean, that one sentence I wish was just like on every free market economist's wall for them to understand this. The scope of praxeology is the explication of the category of human action. All that is needed for the deduction of all praxeological theorems is knowledge of the essence of human action. It is a knowledge that is our own because we are men. No being of human descent that pathological conditions have not reduced to a merely vegetative existence lacks it. No special experience is needed in order to comprehend these theorems, and no experience, however rich, could disclose them to a being who did not know a priori what human action is. The only way to a cognition of these theorems is logical analysis of our inherent knowledge of the category of action. We must bethink ourselves, and this is the quote that you read earlier, and reflect upon the structure of human action. Like logic and mathematics, praxeological knowledge is in us. It does not need to come from without. All the concepts and theorems of praxeology are implied in the category of human action. The first task is to extract and to deduce them, to expound their implications, and to define the universal conditions of acting as such.
Right, and the question is, what does Mises mean by all that? Because to any beginner or even an intermediate, somebody who's intermediate who's been reading some economics or even philosophy, for example, if you were in a philosophy class in college and you read that, I'm pretty sure 99% of people wouldn't even know what he's talking about. So it takes a while to try to figure out what is he saying? What does he mean? Or what's his vision? He has a clear vision. So he knows what he's trying to say or what he means. That doesn't mean we know, because we haven't read Kant and understood the categories the way Mises does. And Mises's view of what certainty is or necessity in social phenomena. So I think a student can read that and gain inspiration, but still spend a lot of time trying to understand what Mises meant or it means by that. And you can give up too. You can say, well, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't really know what he's talking about. That's just not an approach that's appealing to me. but to many of us, it was very appealing and very inspirational. So that's one of the, one of those inspirational passages that lets you know there's some knowledge he has that I want to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then I say one can unbundle the subsidiary notions contained within the conception of action by simply thinking of conditions whose absence would make the existence of action nonsensical. For example, the notion of action without time is clearly nonsensical, and so time is a necessary implication of action. One potentially confusing aspect of Mises's writing is that he referred to necessary implications of actions as, quote, categories of action. Thus, now we have two meanings of category of action. There is the general innate conception of action itself, which was the first meaning we met with, and now there are subsidiary notions that are bundled up in the conception of action. These subsidiary notions are also characterized as categories because they are also innate and prior to experience. Thus, we can also say that time is a category of action. The best way of distinguishing between the two meanings is to keep in mind that the category of action refers to the former definition and a category of action refers to the latter. Other subsidiary categories of action include the existence of an actor, the felt uneasiness of the actor's anticipation of the possible success of action, technological ideas or recipes, plans for specific arrangements of means to achieve ends, an environment in which exists possible means or goods for the attainment of ends, utility, the perceived causal relevance of various means for the alleviation of felt uneasiness, a scarcity of means with regard to ends that could potentially be served, economization, the allocation of scarce means to various ends, preference, ranking alternative actions, allocating scarce means according to the relative priorities of various ends, choice, undertaking the highest ranked action for the sake of the highest priority end it serves, and opportunity cost, the second highest ranked action that is foregone when the highest ranked action is chosen. Very importantly, the causality category itself is a category of human action because, again, and so this is the Hoppe point that I mentioned before, because, again, as Mises noted, action would be unthinkable without the assumption of regularity in the natural world. Yeah, so those are all economic concepts that we can derive from the category of action. And so, already we're doing economics through praxeology.
Have anything for that?
Okay, the above are subsidiary categories of all action, but praxeology is not limited to propositions of such great generality as that, else it would not be nearly as useful as it actually is. Mises wrote, having shown what conditions are required by any action, one must go further and define, of course in a categorical and formal sense, the less general conditions required for special modes of acting. For example, one can think about the special mode of action, indirect exchange, exchanging for a good only for the purpose of exchanging that good for yet another good. And then think about the conditions that would be required for that special mode. These conditions would include the existence of more than two actors, the existence of at least three goods, etc. So, this is basically what an economist does through what's called Crusoe economics. And that's like Frederick Bastiat used Robinson Crusoe in his explanations of economic principles. And it's basically, doing a thought experiment, or what Mises called an imaginary construction of like, okay, well, there are certain things that you can say about all action in any given situation, but then you can also introduce into your thought experiment certain situations. And then you can say, okay, well, what's logically true about action in that specific situation? So, for example, that you could put Crusoe on the island and you can have him acting, and you could say, like, okay, well, you could posit that he is producing a capital good that he uses to create a consumer good. And then, you can then say, like, okay, what are some things that are necessarily true about that situation, about action in that situation, based on the the assumed conditions. And then you could add to the thought experiment. That you could say, like, okay, Friday, the character in Robinson Crusoe that Crusoe meets, that you could introduce Friday to the island, and then you have interpersonal action, and you can ask yourself, okay, what can we say about Crusoe and Friday? And then you can keep adding people to the island, and you can say, like, okay, what could we say about 8 people offering coconuts for exchange, and 8 people offering up like bananas in exchange for that. And then you can say, okay, well, and in that situation, let's say that the coconut traders have these preference scales, and the banana traders have these preference scales, and then they have like an auction, basically. And given those preference scales, you can actually deduce what trades would be made. And from that kind of reasoning, you could infer the law of supply and demand. And so, again, that's basically how praxeology works.
I mean, I think that's one version. That's not the version that I'm familiar with, but I mean, I feel that's the kind of the Mises Institute conception of praxeology, or the Rothbardian. I don't agree with it 100%, but I'm not here to you know my purpose today is not to overturn that, or to contradict it.
Well, I'd be curious why you think that it's the Mises Institute or Rothbard, and not straight from Mises itself, because I'm really just drawing from Mises himself.
Well, I mean, I think in economics or in social phenomena, there's going to be a proposed action or a proposed policy, and that's the A. And then there's the claimed consequence or claimed result, B. And the essential conflict that the Austrians have with mainstream or institutional economists is that there is a necessary relation. There is a way of approaching that information where there's necessary relationships between A and B, not just empirical ones. And so that's the main controversy. And so if we stipulate somebody on an island, or two people on an island, or a government policy, then we say, well, okay, here's this person, and then given this assumption, what will they do, or what will be the result of what they do? What's the B? And so the preamble, the praxeology as preamble, with all of the ideas of how praxeology works, is kind of the let's say full transparency notice of what we're doing. Here's how we're going to approach it. But then we have to get to the part of actually making a prediction. I'll give you an example of when I was I may have mentioned this before, I was at a conference in Toronto 10 or 15 years ago, and there were two Austrian economists there, and this was after Ben Bernanke had printed a boatload of money, and the inflation never happened, and the recession never happened that followed it, and they were totally perplexed because their teachings had taught them that the inevitable consequence had to be a massive recession or a massive inflation. So regardless of what we call the kind of theory we're doing, to me, it just has to go back to either it's an empirical relationship, either B may or may not happen. We just have to go do A and see what happens, or there is a necessary relationship, which is kind of what Menger was insisting in his work about theoretical science in the book, in Methods, into the investigation of the methods of social sciences. So the idea that praxeology has certain kind of there's preference scales and time preference, etc. But that really doesn't get to the issue yet. We still have the issue of an assumed act and then an assumed consequence, or an assumed policy and assumed consequence. And praxeology was supposed to be, or is advertised as, one that gives certainty in that relationship. But it's elusive because other than just stipulating, well, if we have this guy who has 5 preferences and we have another guy who has 6 preferences, and as a logical matter, then they have to do that. That's fine on paper, but what about a real person? How do we predict, okay, John did this, now what's going to happen? That's the part that really has to be explained. And I don't know if that problem has been solved. Because I don't know, the inflation, like I said, the economists, the inflation didn't happen as predicted, and the recession didn't happen as predicted. And so, but I don't know if they were bothered by that, because, Dan, when we see all sorts of things being done, and of course we don't agree with all the things being done, but when we try to say what the inevitable result, and the inevitable result doesn't happen, then have we succeeded, and has our theory succeeded?
Well, the certainty, the apodictic certainty involved in praxeology doesn't pertain to predicting real world events, because real world events are extremely complex, and so there are any number of factors that might be at play that, just by knowing praxeology, it doesn't make you omniscient. It doesn't make you know all of those factors. So the kind of apodictic certainty that praxeology brings is what can't be true based on what is known about a situation, and based on, like, the understanding of action and the implications of certain kinds of action. And and so imaginary constructions are not extremely complex, like that by intention they are simplified. They're simplifications. It's and so you can infer the results of an auction with preference scales pre-known, but in reality you don't know any people's preference scales. Like preference scales are actually demonstrated by the action itself, and so you can't predict the outcome of a real world auction because you don't know their preference scales. And but that doesn't mean that the law of supply and demand, to the extent that it is theoretically and praxeologically derived, is useless. Like, that is basically the logic that's going on that is forming prices, even though you don't know the specific data of any given instance of price formation. Um and yeah, and it's not Rothbard. It's straight from Mises, and even before Mises. Like, it was Böhm-Bawerk who did like that auction thought experiment with the marginal pairs deciding the equilibrium price, the market clearing price. And Mises just completely accepted Böhm-Bawerk's explanation. And so in Human Action, Mises just basically just really briefly just explains the logic of Böhm-Bawerk's analysis without elaborating on it, because like you could see, like, one thing that's very clear is that Mises, like, he would dwell on things that he was really contributing something new to. So like economic calculation and the business cycle theory, like these were things that his predecessors didn't work out. And so like he was really trying to advance the science, like, and so he would spell those things out that he was developing and was on the frontier of. But the things that were already worked out, like, Menger, Menger and Böhm-Bawerk working out like the law of marginal utility and the logic of price theory and like the law of demand and things like that. I mean, he would just deal with those in a paragraph and just boil that down to just like a single paragraph, and then he was done with it. He didn't like to dedicate a whole chapter to it. But that was part of his praxeological system, was reasoning about that. And he also, I mean, I'm not making it up myself. Like, I'm getting it from Mises, this notion of the imaginary, what Mises called the imaginary construction, and economic laws being like completely true to the extent that the premises actually obtain. And the notion that doesn't make that doesn't make the future predictable, because you can't just predict based on praxeology. You have to use what Mises called thymology, which is the anticipation of people's actual value scales. And so he says that historians are thymologists of the past, where they look at what happened in the past and try to infer what the values of the actors were, and that entrepreneurs are thymologists of the future, because they're trying to anticipate consumer demand. They're trying to anticipate consumer preference scales, and then based on that, um, rearrange the means of production to better serve those preference scales. But it takes more than being a sound economist to be an entrepreneur. You have to be a judge of character, and a judge of what people seem to want, and a judge of what people are going to want in the future, and things like that. So yeah. So another way of thinking about it is that praxeological economic laws are ceteris paribus laws. Like, all other things being equal, this is necessarily true. So like, but then all other things are not equal. So it might be different than what you might have expected. And so, for example, like, if a price of a commodity is going up, that might be an instance of the law of demand, because demand is going up, and that's what's making the price is going up. Or it might be an instance of inflation, that the that the supply of money is going up, and so is more money chasing the same amount of goods, and so it bids the price up. And it's more than economics to explain which one is happening. Like, it's economic history, which goes beyond just economics. It has to be, you have to have statistics, and in order to figure those things out.
Yeah, I think what my takeaway from what you're saying is that it goes back to the old philosophical problem that to the extent this something is certain, it doesn't apply to reality, and to the extent it applies to reality, then it's not certain, which was also, I think, in physics. So, uh, uh, which I think what we're saying is that praxeological knowledge doesn't give you certain knowledge of events in reality, but it gives you certainty, like a mathematical equation. But that doesn't mean that the relationships in the mathematical equation will hold when you apply them to the real world.
Well,
But
it can give you certainty in the sense of certainty of whether a policy will achieve what it's trying to accomplish. Because, for example, price theory can show you that the minimum wage is a bad policy, because price theory shows you that that if you create a minimum wage, then by definition, um, people whose marginal productivity is below that level, that they will be disemployed. Like, that's just a matter of logic. a- and it might be the case that after a minimum wage is passed, that employment rates actually do go up, but but that might have been caused by, for example, if people became more productive, and so the minimum wage didn't actually have any impact, because of some training program that was going around or something, uh, or because inflation that could actually cause it, that people's marginal productivity was higher than the level of the minimum wage. And so then, an empiricist could say then, well, you see, price theory is wrong. Like, we raised the minimum wage and employment went up. And it's like, no, that's not true. Like, it was this other factor that came into play that made the minimum wage meaning, like, not have any effect at all. But it's still true that you can't improve the rate of employment by creating a minimum wage, like by logical necessity, by definition. And so it's still certain, like the propositions of economics are relevant to the real world, and it does give you certainty into which whether an economic policy will have the kinds of effects that you're hoping they will have. But that's just one factor, is that policy. It doesn't predict whether other policies will come into play and have effects that the advocates of the policy attribute to their policy.
Well, I think we're touching on the issue, which is probably that we could spend a lot of time talking about this. I think we have touched on the essential issue, which is what is the practical value of the knowledge if it can't tell me what will happen tomorrow if I do something today, and that is kind of the main. The nub, as somebody once said in the history of Austrian economics, the nub of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a government official and you want to impose a minimum wage, it can tell you, it can tell you ceteris paribus the effect of your policy if you implement it. That doesn't mean it'll tell you exactly what will happen, but it will tell you like whether your policy did any good or not. And that's useful because then we can use that and say, okay, I'm not going to impose a minimum wage. And that kind of that level of prediction, even though it's not like crystal ball, like fortune telling type prediction, it's still good enough to do something to make such an important decision as not imposing a minimum wage.
Well, I think that that warrants probably a lengthier discussion, because I think what we're saying is that the negative consequences won't be observable, but we know they're there because we have a theory that says that there's something negative happened. Because if it was observable, you could say, well, if you do this, I can show you what this is going to happen. I think we're saying we're ruling that out ahead of time, that we won't be able to see it. So I think that's an epistemological challenge.
Well, and everything is counterfactual because, compared to what? That you might be saying like, well, I don't see the negative consequence of doing that. But maybe there was a negative consequence because maybe things improved, but they would have improved more if you hadn't imposed that policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very like real distinction, because on the one hand, as you said in many episodes, that we have been piling on socialist policy after socialist policy, but at the same time, living standards have been improving. Technology has been, and largely it's because of countervailing factors, that technology has been improving, that entrepreneurs have been solving problems in a way that has been outpacing the destruction of policymakers. And so unless you have that kind of distinction, you know socialist policymakers might say like, look, we've been layering on socialist law after socialist law, and look at the poverty rate, it's going down, and look at life expectancy, it's going up, so therefore we must be doing something right. But of course the answer to that is that theoretically we know socialist policies are destructive, and so we know that if we hadn't had those shows policies, that poverty would have still gone down, but have gone down even further than it did.
Yeah, again, I'm probably not going to solve this tonight, but there's an issue that that it's in the world of the counterfactual is just a world where it's not. In other words, we're going to all agree that on the observable A, that of what the action was, the policy was, but then we're going to have controversy about the B.
The seen
so-
versus the unseen.
Yeah. So I think there's something there about unobservability that is part of the equation, because if it were different, we in other words, the standard of knowledge, physical knowledge, is able to through the regularity that of their devices that we all use, setting into motion a certain event is invariably leads to a second event that we can depend upon, and enhance our life by controlling those two things. But we haven't been able to figure that out in the social world. And I think what we're saying right now, at least as far as I know, that we're never going to be able to solve that. So maybe there's some truth to that we're never going to have that kind of clarity with cause and effect in the social realm that you get in the physical realm, because every time you strike a match, you set into motion a chemical reaction, and it happens the same way every time. But so an A is always followed by a B in the physical, but in a social, we all see the A. The Fed is printing, but nobody agrees on the B. So I feel that's what Mises was trying to answer through his system, and whether he succeeded, for me, is still an open question. It's controversial, because, as you know, the passage in Epistemological Problems where we deduce from the theory when the price of a commodity rises, its production will be increased. And then he goes on to explain how the price of a commodity can rise and production doesn't get increased. So, that to me the question, it was left as an open question. We want to show that our theory gives apodictic certainty between two events, and yet Mises is plainly saying that we don't have that kind of information in his system. So I find that it's a potential that it's a failing of the system, but maybe we're saying no, you can never have that kind of information in the social sciences. It's always going to be counterfactual information, that we're going to say, well, we can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow, but if you do this, things could have been worse. But I don't know how to say it, but I think that's why social science is held in disdain, because it can't produce, or hasn't so far produced, that kind of rigorous knowledge that actually applies to social. For example, if somebody commits a crime, is there anything that has to happen to that person? We know that he doesn't necessarily have to go to jail. He may never get caught. He may never have social disapproval. But is there any necessity to committing a crime? Is there anything at all? We have no idea right now. I mean, nobody knows. If you spend your whole life, murdering millions of people, is there anything that happens to you, in the real world, not just in the afterlife? But I mean, we have no idea. I mean, it's, because we say, well, somebody psychologically, they're unhappy. If you have that life, you're not going to be happy. Okay, well, I'm open to that argument. So show me how that works. I think Rothbard mentioned that one time. I think he said in the Ethics of Liberty, he thinks it's able to prove that if somebody's doing something, that it might impact their happiness. Okay, well then demonstrate that. Where's that knowledge? How does it work? oh, if you do this, you're going to be an unhappy person. Well, nobody can say that with confidence. I mean, I would like to believe that everybody who's doing bad things is unhappy. I would love to believe that, but I don't know. I don't know that as a fact, you know. But so Dan, I'm sympathetic to. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Mises. So, but I guess maybe I differ from the common explanation of what he's saying. I think there were still some unsolved issues. I guess some unsolved issues that were left on the table, and so I've tried to explain those best I can, but I'm not really prepared to say it as clearly as I should.
Well, that's fine. That's interesting. Well, thanks, Adam. I think that's a good stopping point. I think I've covered the basics of praxeology enough for hopefully the viewers to get intrigued and crack open a Mises book. And I hope that they do.
Yeah, highly recommended. And I mean, for me, human action is great. I like the first 200 pages. I don't know. Do you have something you'd recommend that they read that you think compares that you think is the first book that somebody could read?
Well, if they're interested in the epistemological stuff, I really like Theory and History because it's a later work, and so his ideas were even more developed. But also, it's just shorter than Human Action. So if you're into the epistemology stuff, but you don't want a 900-word tome, Theory and History is interesting in that regard. And he also kind of delves into broader topics of like social philosophy as well. So it's just a really good book.
I really responded well to, I think it was The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. It's a short book, and I think he was pretty old. Roderick Long said he was over 80 years old when he wrote it. But it's pretty easy to read, and it just shows his amazing intelligence and wisdom. I remember reading that early on, and this was when I had to go to the library and get it and make copies. So I actually made a copy of the entire book. This is way back when. This is like sometime in the 90s, probably. Even early 90s, maybe even late 80s. I don't know. It was a long time ago, and I went to the library and got a copy, just made photocopies. And that's how I had the book in my possession for a while.
Wow.
So yeah, so it was old school stuff. In the old days when you scraping for knowledge in public libraries or whatever, or books that that weren't widely available. Because it's maybe before Amazon. So.
Yeah, and then before the Mises Institute digitized all of his major works.
Yeah. Well, if there's something we didn't cover, or something was not satisfactorily dealt with, or something, we can always return to it if you like. And but thanks for giving us a nice, thorough explanation, letting people know kind of what it's all about.
Sure. Thank you, Adam.
Till next time, everyone. Thank you for staying with us.